headquarters.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, religion, or national origin. Up next, on Real America, from 1971, a panel of 5 women discussed the status of their rights at a time when the women's movement was advocating for more changes in American society. This was one in a series of 10 University of Michigan Television Center programs on the topic titled Girls and Women.
Girls and Women, Images and Realities. The University of Michigan Television Center presents a series of programs on the nature and potential of American women. Your host is Lynn Mattoon of the Department of Philosophy, University of Michigan. Today's program, Women, Law, and Politics, explores what the law says about women and what women are doing about the law.
American women have taken an increasingly active role in public life during the last century. They worked hard to win the right to vote and finally succeeded with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Many women have worked for candidates in political causes, and some have served in elected offices on the local, state, and national levels. But one could hardly say that today's women dominate or even lead in any area of law or politics. Women are still a functional minority, though they actually outnumber the men in our population. Recently, a number of women's organizations have asked for change, calling attention to inequities based on sex throughout our society. Today we're going to discuss some of these issues concerning freedom for women in public and private life. We'll also look at how women are working to resolve these issues, hopefully for the benefit of all the people in our country. I'd like you to meet my guests, 4 women who share an interest in what American women are trying to do. Martha Griffiths, representative from the state of Michigan to the Congress of the United States. Wanda Ripe, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. Nancy Hartzog, lecturer in the University of Michigan Department of Political Science. And Marjorie Lansing, assistant professor in history at Eastern Michigan University. Mrs. Griffiths, what do you think are the most important changes that have taken place in respect to the status of women since you've been in Congress?
Well, I think perhaps most important was the one that added sex to the bill of 1964. This bill was drafted really to help Negroes. Now, it wasn't clear. It would have meant that Negro women would have been given rights that were not available to white women. Therefore, we added sex. It is my belief that the drafters had assumed that no women would get any rights. So that I think both white and black women were helped by the bill. Hundreds of cases have been started under it. Thousands of complaints have been made. But we still have a long way to go.
Marjorie, I understand you've done a study of women's voting patterns. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found in that study, how they vote?
There's real news in the voting patterns of American women. I would think from looking at 50 years of the female vote that one could say that the women's vote may well be a time bomb in the 1970 election. That's because the dramatic changes in the lifestyles of women are reflected in the way they vote. To be specific, when women go out of the home and take a job, when women go to college, then they vote. When they stay in static or traditional environments, they don't vote. Now that means that in the 1964 and the 1968 presidential elections, women for the first time in this country voted at the same levels as men. And college women, in fact, women who've had even 1 year of college, vote at the same levels as men. And in the 64 and 68 presidential elections, they were more active than men in helping with the campaigns. So while there's really been a slow burn, I would say that predictably, because of these major changes that you know of, the women vote will be heard from in the 1970s as it has not been heard from at all in this country.
Do you have any indications, or is there any way of telling how women vote and so the issues they tend to support and so on?
As you know, statistics are not compiled by sex. As one votes, one doesn't register as a man or a woman. But from 20 years of very good data from research organizations, we know that women perceive politics in a different way. Now, they are less military-minded than men. They're much better on civil rights issues. And this is reflected in campaigns in which candidates pick that up. For example, the aspirant John F. Kennedy realized early in his campaign that women were not supporting him. And they do operate as a bloc, but it's somewhat imperceptible because it's not perceived by the voting booth as women. But there's a marked difference in the way they perceive this. So as you get an increasing number of women going to the polls, I would suggest that since they outnumber men, and they also greatly affect the Electoral College because women are concentrated more in cities than on the farm, and they affect the outcome of the presidential election. So that there's a dramatic, I really believe there's news in terms of women's vote.
A candidate had better give some thought to
this. A candidate better be sure he analyzes his data on women a little better, and especially younger women, because women from the ages of 21 to 30 behave very differently from their mothers or their grandmothers, as we well know, and this applies to the voting booth as well as to style of dress or jobs or any other phase of life.
Could we talk a little bit about women in law? Does the profession encourage women? Is it because since many of the difficulties women encounter are legal difficulties, it would behoove women to have support within the profession, I believe.
Well, my experience has not been that the profession encourages women. Most men who are lawyers right now do not really believe that women, especially women in law school now, are serious about practicing law and about becoming lawyers. I think that as more women go to law school, and I think especially with my class, which was the first class to graduate a substantial number of women, I think that as more women get out into the field and make themselves known and practice law, I think there'll be a changing attitude. But I think right now, the number of women who are practicing law is so small that most men don't really understand women in law, accept them, or encourage them.
What about the current movement, the women's liberation movement? Do you see any parallels with that and the civil rights movement? I think, Nancy, you might know about that.
Well, there are a number of parallels, and of course that's really not surprising since both are movements of oppressed people. And I think that another reason that the parallels aren't surprising is that the women's movement is very much a descendant of the civil rights movement in very direct terms and very direct ways. So that the women's movement really began in the middle 60s, and a large percentage of the people who made it up were people who had earlier been active in the civil rights movement and who had begun to see that while they were working for the freedom of blacks, they, as women within the movement, really weren't free. And they began then to have a whole reevaluation of their role within the movement and within society in general. So I think that there's the kind of direct influence that the civil rights movement has. I think that in terms of real parallels, there are a number. One of them, I suppose, would be the fact that the civil rights movement has now, through the 60s, become a black liberation movement and has moved from demanding equal access to public accommodations, as it did in 1960 with the lunch counter activities, moved from that to a much more thoroughgoing statement of what black people need, and has really expanded to a critique of the whole system of American democracy and the way that it operates. And I think that the women's movement, in a much shorter period of time, has done the same thing. I mean, partly it was able to do that because the groundwork for a lot of the critiques had been laid by the civil rights movement. But I think that the women's movement is now sort of divided in the same ways. That is, there are those in the women's movement who would correspond very much to the NAACP and the civil rights movement. That is, who are proposing legal action as one way of bringing women into full participation in society. And I think that there are also women in the women's liberation movement who would be very much in agreement with the critique proposed by leaders of the black liberation movement, so that there are very, very many parallels.
Well, what about civil rights? Are there civil rights that women do not enjoy?
Well, I think that there certainly are. I think that maybe I should turn it back to Martha Griffiths, but I would like to add one footnote to what she said about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because the or sex provision was added really as a joke. It was put in by a Southern congressman.
Please don't say that.
To keep it from being passed.
That. It was not added as a joke. The man who originally offered it thought that he was really going to hurt the bill, but I made the argument, and I wasn't joking. I understood exactly what it would do. It was accepted not as a joke, but because the people who sat there agreed with my argument, that you would have given black women rights that white women never had had. Now, I didn't make the further statement, which I think was quite true, that no one who brought that bill to the floor had ever considered giving any woman any rights. And the truth is that black and white women got those rights together. But no one who voted that day voted as a joke.
I'm sure that they didn't vote as a joke, but there was a great deal of levity in the debate that went on, and a great deal of guffawing.
The levity stopped when I started speaking.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that. I think I read the Senate debate.
It really didn't work out that way at all. But this has been one of the things that it's a myth that has been put out through this whole country, that it was a joke. And every woman who says it again and again really aids the Supreme Court in making a very erroneous decision.
Could you just document a little bit just what the civil rights status of women was before and after?
Well, of course, women don't really have any rights. The 14th Amendment has never been applied to give women equal rights, equal protection under the law. She doesn't have any rights. Only the right to vote and the right to hold public office. Those are the only two rights that the Constitution of the United States guarantees her. On everything else, she is protected by the law of the Middle Ages, the common law of England. She had no rights. And this is the first right. Now, with one case has gotten to the Supreme Court under Title VII. And on that case, the Supreme Court made a very poor decision.
Could you elaborate about the case?
Well, the case was a woman who applied to Martin Marietta. I believe she was in Florida. She had 5 children. They told her that they would not take a woman who had children under the age of 6. It was a $3 an hour job. But they admitted in court that of course, they wouldn't think of asking a man that question, that the man that they hired did have children under 6. Now, this was a clear case of discrimination. And the Supreme Court, in its decision, sent the decision back to the lower court for further information as to whether or not women with children under 6 were good employees. What kind of nonsense is that? What did that have to do with that woman? Whether other women were good employees with children under 6. Furthermore than that, what the Supreme Court was really saying was that this woman, who was the sole support of the children, their father had abandoned them. It was perfectly all right for her to work at $1 an hour. No one was going to ask any embarrassing questions about, do you have children under 6? But when you got to $3 an hour, that's different. Then we will save those jobs for men.
This brings up the whole area of work and equal pay and equal benefits and so on. Social Security, for example. I think this is another one of your causes.
Well, the Social Security law is perhaps the most inequitable law that is written by the federal government. A woman pays in on exactly the same basis that a man pays. But until I went on the Ways and Means Committee, if she were out of the labor force for 1.5 years and died, even her own children couldn't draw on Social Security. And her husband can't draw yet. She has to be supplying more than half support before her husband can draw on her wages. Now, at the present time, if a man works 2 jobs and pays on Social Security and pays above the base, and the base is going to be $10,500 next year, he can take a credit on his income tax. But if a husband and wife work together and they pay in on $19,000 and they make out a joint return, they can take no credit. Yet when they come to draw on the Social Security, the wife doesn't draw as his wife and then on her own. She takes her choice. She draws either on him or on her own. So that a working husband and wife are really supporting those where the wife doesn't work.
Lynn, shouldn't we say here that I think the significance of these discriminations is that it makes a parallel, it documents your point, because there has been it's not generally known by women, the fact that they have so much discrimination against them legally, that they're not protected by the 14th Amendment or the due process law.
Of course not.
And like the black movement, like the civil rights movement, there has been a kind of awakening in which women are beginning to learn that the legal discriminations with respect to work, with respect to the whole court scene, is really highly discriminatory. Isn't that right, Mrs.
Yes.
Griffiths?
Some poor
Women
woman
don't know
wrote
it.
in and said, well, now in community property states, surely there are no problems. As late as 1968, the Supreme Court refused a woman married more than 20 years an accounting of the property that the husband had been managing all those years. So she has no rights at all.
I think that younger women, people who are more closer to my age, who are just now coming out into the job market, are being radically awakened to the great discrimination that goes on. I think especially the things that affect us now, such as equal pay for equal work and salary differentials based merely on sex as opposed to job status or the type of job you do. And I think that a lot of younger women, as they're finding out about this, I've noticed, are not accepting this as much as women have in the past. I think this is also a reflection of the growing awareness that's occurred in the past 10 years of the discrimination against women. And I suspect that as this becomes more generally known, you're not going to have the acceptance and the lack of awareness that you have in the past about the really basic inequities in our law as to the treatment of women in a variety of situations, especially related to job situations.
What about these protective laws? Don't they sometimes work against the women?
Well, of course they do. For instance, there's a weightlifting law, presumably, in many states. But it only applies in certain areas. It never applies in a retail store. It never says that a 90-pound nurse can't lift a 300-pound man.
Yeah.
This is different.
Would you be in favor of just doing away with those protective
Of course,
laws?
and Title VII did that. When you added sex to Title VII, it did it. And I said it on the floor that day that it would do that is what it would do. I hope that it would do it. Of course it should wipe them out.
But unfortunately, states still have laws that are not being affected because
But
of
many
federal
of
law.
them have wiped them out. Many of them have said the federal law supersedes. But the point to make is that a family supported by a woman is discriminated against as opposed to a family supported by a man.
But it also should be pointed out that women who are so-called housewives and who are not employed or who are not in poverty are also discriminated against legally
Of
with respect to their
course.
whole life. They
Of
don't generally
course.
recognize. And the protective laws have been used deliberately to really to keep women discriminated against even more so. Isn't that right?
Of
It's used
course.
by members of Congress. It's even used by the labor movement, unfortunately, to keep the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, to go in. And it's a misunderstanding of the intent of the bill. Isn't that a proper way to say it?
A Mrs. Perez out in the state of Arizona only recently brought a case to the Supreme Court where she had lost the right to drive her car because her husband had been involved in an accident and couldn't pay the judgment. She wasn't even in the car when it happened. Now, when the Supreme Court considered it, they said that a discharge in bankruptcy, which this family had gone through, discharged that obligation, and therefore they could no longer take the licenses to drive away. But that wasn't even what the decision should have been based on. What right did anybody have to take her driver's license away because her husband had had an accident?
What about more different kinds of laws? For instance, property rights, welfare laws. The welfare laws discriminate against women insofar as I think you cannot have a woman living with a man receiving welfare.
You can't have a man.
You can have a man living with a woman receiving welfare benefits.
Well, you can't have, originally, you couldn't have a man in the house, an able-bodied man. Now that has been changed. You can have that.
Oh,
But
okay.
welfare is really a discrimination against women because they were so discriminated against in the job market. Really.
the amount of money they're getting on welfare is much less than they could ever get if they were being employed at a substantial job, as in the situation with a woman in Florida who might have had to go on welfare when she had that many children to support and she couldn't get a job.
And you certainly, if you're working for $1 an hour, you certainly couldn't provide for your children under
Not
6.
too well.
So it's really, it's terrific. I've often considered what would happen if my husband died. I would barely be able to support us with all the child care and the...
Well, of course, Social Security has another little horror in it. If you have less than 3 children, you would draw Social Security from your husband. And the moment you walked out the door to work, you would lose your share of it, which is absolute nonsense. It would be better if you kept your share and worked.
Yeah. Let me say that aren't there 2 kinds of changes? One, a change to a more technological society is going to tend to make the argument the protective law somewhat ludicrous. And secondly, the fact that women are going into higher education in such numbers that there may be a real change, I think, in the next decade. I think what we're describing is the constant, is what's happening now, but is not going to be the next 10-year period. I think we should make a benchmark in terms of the times in which we're discussing this. Because I'm very optimistic about it.
Very quickly.
Well, I'm optimistic about it because of the kinds of changes that are
What I
occurring.
think would be interesting would be to ask both of you, what chance do we have of having some more women legislators and some more women in office?
Well, I think I should defer to you first on that question. And,
Well, as you well know, women have been, while their voting patterns are marked in the sense they've gone out to vote in the same numbers as men, as you well know, they've not gone into political office. Now, one reason is that they have not been in the professions in which people are recruited for that. You know, half of the members of Congress are members of the law school, so perhaps Wanda will belong to an age group which will recruit women to go into politics. Secondly, the success syndrome for women in this country is to get married, have a fine husband, and happy children. And this doesn't combine too well with politics. But my study shows when women do go into politics, they go at the local level, so they can still have that fine husband and happy children, which, as you know, this combination of roles is what I think may occur to a greater extent because there'll be more part-time employment and more part-time opportunities for women in politics.
Or maybe
Although
Nancy
some jobs
can push some more
what
on
do you
men.
think about
What do
that?
you think, Nancy?
I think that we may find that the general public is a great deal more ready for it than the structure of the political parties. One of the issues that I think really shows this kind of thing is the abortion issue, where surveys show that the general public, by and large, is willing to accept it, but yet it really can't get through the legislatures. And I think that the same kind of thing may well be operative in the case of women in politics. That is that a majority of the population now says that they would be willing to consider a woman as president. But
Is that a fact?
that's
Yeah, that's right.
But I think that it will be a great deal longer before either of the major parties is willing to do that. And it might well be that if you took a survey sample of people who were officers of those major parties, you would find a great difference, and it would be a very small minority of that group that would be willing to consider a woman as president. So that I think that you really do have a kind of opposition from the party structure. And one of the things that I think some surveys have shown, mostly the ones that I know of, were done in Europe, but I presume that they would come out fairly similar. They showed that when women were nominated for public office, they tended to be nominated for offices where in a district that was not a safe district. That is, where they thought that they would lose and where they were really token candidates put up so the party could say, we had so and so many women run, and they just can't get elected. So why bother?
That's right.
Yeah.
I won first in the district in which I won myself. No other member of my party had ever won that district, and I am sure that the party never anticipated that I would win.
Well, this is the story of the way minorities get the vote. This is the story of women's getting the vote in this country. They got it first in the West. This is the story of blacks being able to register and vote in the South. The same pattern where they don't threaten the existing vested interests in this. They are able to vote and participate more.
Yeah, I think actually we are perhaps on the verge of a great change. I hesitate to say that I really think so because women have, in the 1940s, didn't they go into the workforce and then retreat again? But since the pressure is on not to have children rather than to have children, perhaps that would be one significant one of the most significant changes. You know, that it's less, certainly much less encouraged to have large families, and so it's a socially commendable thing. And the whole business about abortion, well, which is also a legal matter. And this also is a question, I think women are the ones who are pushing abortion, and they're the ones who have actually gotten it as far as it's...
And men are the ones who are legislating on it, which I think indicates some of the problems that we have.
You know, they can't believe a woman would... Yeah. It's curious, some of the arguments you hear on that issue.
But the women who went to work in the 40s very frequently went to work in factories, did they not? During that time and the 50s, you have educated more and more women, so that you have a different group of women who are seeking work today outside their homes. Would this not be true?
That's true. Almost all women in America have graduated from high school by 1970, and a much higher proportion have gone on to college than any previous decade.
And 80% of all college-educated women work. The first thing I think every little girl should know today is that she is going to work outside her home.
Yeah.
That the dream world is over.
Yes, I think that's true, that children should be, women children and boy children should be brought up to find something that they want to do themselves. And there's going to be no hanging on to anyone else as, you know, being the source of your self-respect and
Well, hopefully, as the laws become less prohibitive of women working, more women will be more encouraged to go out and work in the workforce. And as the education level increases, more women will realize the advantages to having an education in terms of their ability to get a job in the workforce and their ability to have some say in what goes on in their lives and in other people's lives.
And to have real power in the workforce rather than simply, go to the machine and come home again. The interesting jobs are the most attractive ones, and the fact that they're being open to women is probably going to be a very...
Whether reluctantly or not, they are being open to women, I think. Law, for instance, which normally has less than 2% women in the profession, I think will be opening up in the years to come. And I think medicine, I think engineering, other professions, college professorships, I think are going to be opening up more and more to women as women get a higher education and begin to realize how much they're missing out on by accepting a role that was preordained for them much earlier in their lives.
This comes to the end of our program. I'm sorry we've run out of time. Thank you, Martha and Wanda and Nancy and Marjorie, for being with us. In our next program, we will look into the education of girls through college. I hope you will join us then. Thank you for being with us today.
This program was recorded in the Ann Arbor television studios of the University of Michigan. This is University of Michigan Television.
You're watching American History TV.